Hi everyone! In this video we're gonna do a chassis focus of my X1223, which I recently used to TQ and win the European Championships in the UK. And we're gonna use this video to try and explain about the features of the car, the option parts that I used, as well as a little bit about the setup that I used on the car. So let's start off with explaining about the car, that this is a X1223 EU spec kit, which means that the kit came with aluminum flex chassis. So the chassis has cutouts instead of the solid chassis which comes with the US spec kit. So the EU kit comes with this flex chassis, which is preferable for European grip levels and conditions. The other difference to the US kit is that the EU spec kit, which I ran at this race, comes with 1-dot front kingpins. And what does that mean? It means that I ran 1.5 degrees of camber, which is fixed by the kingpin, and that's distinguished by the 1-dot marking on the kingpin, whereas the US spec kit comes with a 3-dot, so less front camber on the kingpin, which is required for higher grip tracks where you want to reduce the front grip of the car. So those are the main features of the EU spec kit, but let's take a closer look on the option parts that I used and the setup that I used on this car. So let's talk about option parts first and foremost. The only two option parts that I used on this car at this race was the center spring, which is the 4-dot center spring, which is one step stiffer than the kit center spring. Going to a stiffer center spring improves on-power steering, makes the car a bit more responsive, which was well suited for this technical track. And in fact, for most conditions, I usually prefer a 4-dot center spring unless the grip is a bit lower or the car is very difficult to drive. In that case, the kit center spring would make the car more forgiving to drive and not as responsive. I also ran optional side springs on the car, which they look like this. They were the silver 0.6 C rated side springs, which I fitted instead of the kit gold springs. And going to softer side springs makes the damping obviously softer from side to side, and this makes the car again less responsive, a bit more forgiving. You're gonna have a slower direction change, but you're gonna have more side bites. So in this case, especially on the Friday when the grip was lower, the car really benefited from a softer side spring to help generate more side traction. I didn't run any preload on the side springs. I just had them slightly touching the chassis. And those were the option parts. X-Ray is also working on a new front bumper for the X12, so stay tuned for that. It's going to be released soon. About the setup that I ran in the race, 112 scale is all about fine-tuning, so it's all about making a big difference with small changes. But I ran a pretty standard setup. I ended up running the front end with a short wheelbase, which the short wheelbase helps the car to turn on a technical track like the one we saw in Eastbourne. So I ran the kit front flex setting, the kit front caster, kit front spring. I did use a thicker front kingpin lube. So the lube that goes onto the kingpin was 20K, which is on the thick side to make the car a bit less responsive and made it easier to drive through the chicanes especially. I ran the forward Ackerman hole, which to me gives me the best feeling, makes me feel the most connected to the car, as opposed to the rear Ackerman hole, which makes the car a little more dull, a little more forgiving to drive. About the front droop setting, I rarely change the front droop setting on this car, to be honest. I usually prefer to run 0.6 of a millimeter of droop, which if you run the kit spring with a 0.1 millimeter shim underneath here, that's usually perfect for setting 0.6 of a millimeter of droop. Obviously the springs can compress over time, which may require you to add more shims here to have the same amount of droop, but usually these springs, they stay good for a long time and you don't need to adjust the preload of the spring at all with shims. But yeah, of course you can add droop by taking out the shim completely. Then you'll have about 0.8 to 1 mil of droop, which will give you even more front grip, but the car will be a bit harder to drive, especially on fast direction changes like chicanes. So 0.6 of a millimeter of front droop. For spec classes, probably you'll want to use a little bit less. Often that is the case. You'll end up running 0.4 or such. Some guys in the US, they prefer even less, but for European conditions, for modified, 0.6 is the way to go. As for the flex settings of the side braces, on Friday and Saturday I ran the side braces fully connected, so in 1, 2, 3, 4 spots they were connected to the chassis and to the rear brace. However, for Sunday morning, the grip had come down a little bit from the track, which means the car was starting to understeer a bit. So for A1, I decided to disconnect this brace here from the rear brace, which that gave the car more flex, obviously, and it helped the car to turn in the center of the corner. So that really gave me the mid-corner steering that I needed to be able to pull away from the competition in A1. If you move on to the rear end, the side tubes were 10K oil, so pretty standard. Softer side spring, like I mentioned before. The battery is one step from full front. I did test to move the battery further back, but it just made the car looser and didn't have any big benefit in handling on this track. So I prefer to run the battery forward rather than backwards in the car. And furthermore, I ran a anti-squat setting, as I would refer to it, in the back. So the front ride height is measured here at 3 millimeters, or 3.2 actually. The middle ride height, the same as the front, 3.2 millimeters, is measured here under the rear pod. Eventually, I ran 3.8 millimeters of height underneath the rear pod. So this means that the pod sits at an angle like this. So why would you want the pod to be angled into the ground? Because the anti-squat setting that you acquire by doing that with your ride height, it basically gives you more forward traction. So it pushes the rear pod into the ground and gives you more grip when you accelerate. Instead of having the ride height completely flat everywhere, having the rear pod angled into the floor gives you more forward traction. So that's another key thing in the setup, which I've been using a lot lately. Other than that, nothing too special. Gear ratio 34/80, pretty standard for a 6.5 turn motor. The rear track width maxed out as wide as it can go, 172 millimeters. That's as wide as the rules allow. And the side braces, or the side links, they're actually called, they are shimmed up here. So 1.5 mil of shim in the front point of the side link, which makes the car more aggressive and gives you more mid-corner steering as well. The pod droop, 1.4 millimeters. I usually play with the pod droop in steps of 0.2 millimeters. So going up or down with the pod droop, yeah, it has a big effect on the handling. I did go as low as 1.2, but as high as 1.6 at some point during the weekend. So I always fine-tune the pod droop depending on how aggressive I want to make the car. So as you can see, the car is really standard, just 2 option parts used, which means that anybody can buy and drive the exact car that I used to win the European Championships. And I think this is a very important point and very interesting for the customers to know. So last but not least, I would like to thank the organizing club of Eastbourne, the BRCA, EFRA, for organizing a great European Championships, which was very memorable for our team and for everybody that was present. And yeah, thank you for watching this video. If you have any questions or feedback at all about the car, feel free to contact myself or anybody from X-Ray. And the setup that I've used at this race is published on the X-Ray website, setup.teamxray.com, at the setup database, which there's thousands of setups already available on that database, but you can download this specific setup from the European Championship there as well. And that's it.